a student of hermeneutics, should education count? And it's not surprising that the ambiguity is too much to resist. Should education count, as in should education matter? And if so, what in education should matter? And what should matter most? Or should education count, as in taking an account of something? And what, therefore, should education be counting? And to whom or to what is it accountable? I've been doing some counting myself lately, and while I'm not trying to get too far ahead of myself, 2013 will mark my 30th year working in the field of education. Given that 30 years is longer than most of my students have been alive, I've had plenty of time to think and act upon what I think counts in education, and came up with several ideas that have consistently characterized my teaching and research and that respond to the question posed. Paradoxically, I've long held that what counts in education is that which cannot be counted, or the unquantifiable. I suggest that education focus its considerable theoretical and practical attention to aesthetics, where aesthetics is seen not as the exclusive dominion of the arts, but rather occurs, as Herbert Reed and John Dewey would argue, in the exercise of skill, sensibility, and imagination. Aesthetics derives from the Greek aesthetes, meaning to perceive, and portends an inevitable responsibility if one is aesthetically present to another. One has immediately entered into an ethical relationship. Aesthetic sensibility, therefore, invites interrogation as opposed to mere retention or passive acceptance. It is no wonder, therefore, that the art critic and poet Herbert Reed found it difficult to separate art from culture and politics. Building aesthetic capacity in education provides students, teachers, and researchers with the experience to exercise qualitative judgments and develop evaluative criteria. For example, in my research, I have been evaluating the ethical relationship between art and testimony to document the particular challenges of transforming oral history of Holocaust survivors into works of young adult literature. At the same time, I have been working with young adult author Kathy Kaser and a group of Toronto educators on a project that engaged middle school students in Canada, the United States, Italy, and Australia in responding to visual and literary representations of the Holocaust. While students' critical responses took various forms, including fiction, nonfiction, poetry, and visual art, students felt an undeniable sense of responsibility owed to the dead. This feeling is captured by the title of the volume, We Are Their Voice, a line taken from the contribution of Ori Berman, a grade 8 student in Toronto whose grandfather survived 3 years in Auschwitz before being marched from Auschwitz to Buchenwald, and because of Ori, his grandfather's story is now part of yours. The question of voice is an important one in deciding whether education should count and for whom. 3 decades of working in education has taught me girls and women are still finding their voice and taking patriarchy to task in the public, private, and now virtual spheres. Like many feminist literary scholars, I exerted much of my theoretical efforts in recent years on explicating the discursively constructed subject and perhaps more cautiously the transformative promise of literature, while wrestling with articulating that all-important link between individual subjectivity and social political change. In practice, while many literacy scholars and educators have successfully mined young adult literature to promote an understanding of gender that is discursively constructed and that can be subverted by positioned readers, we have not been so successful at demonstrating how to dismantle the actual power relations that construct difference. While researching my chapter contribution for Barbara Guzzetti's and Tom Bean's edited volume, Adolescent Literacies and the Gendered Self, Reconstructing Gender Through Global Multimodal Literacy Practices, I began to problematize the limits of my own assertion that the literary text could prompt young adult readers to disrupt the connection between sex and gender to defy patriarchal conventions. While I continue to believe that the practice of post-structural positioning, which would allow the reader or viewer to gain an awareness of the subjective self, can provide insights into patriarchal totalities, Its retreat into language, identity, and subjectivity runs the risk of fueling neoliberal agendas that say much but participate little in altering the dynamics of political economy. The inability to fully actualize this possibility in the wider social sphere lends one to a heightened sense of impotence and frustration. Like Elizabeth Ellsworth's response to critical pedagogy's failure to interrogate rationalist assumptions that perpetuate relations of domination in the classroom, I have found myself crying out, why doesn't this feel empowering? In suggesting that post-structural feminist thought is not fully up to the task of taking on the new array of material problems facing girls and women brought on by global economic changes, I am currently investigating the potential of material feminist criticism, which emphasizes feminism's legacy in critiquing the material consequences of patriarchy, while still paying attention to the differential positioning of women. And finally, my aesthetic sensibilities would be remiss if, after close to 30 years working in Canadian education, much of it in Winnipeg's inner city core, and later as the province's provincial language arts specialist, if I did not say something about to whom I think education should be accountable, or perhaps more precisely, to whom historically education has not been accountable. If education is to count in Canada, then it must count for all. It is well known that First Nations people in Canada have engaged in a long and complex struggle to dismantle and recover from education's implicit role in perpetuating the pain and anguish of colonization. While their story of victimization has been a demoralizing one, listening to my Aboriginal colleagues and students and heeding the decolonization methods of York colleagues Susan Dion and Celia Haig-Brown, I am cognizant that First Nations people are ready to write a new story. CBC's recent series, Eighth Fire, makes clear the hope that Canadians, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal alike, need to join in writing this story together. So in the spirit of taking up the invitation, I close with the way I should have began, by acknowledging the Seneca on whose land York University was built. Thank you.